As hospitals become targets, humanitarian aid is blocked, and thousands more children are killed. Arms supplies to Israel come under international scrutiny.
We firmly believe in Israel's inherent right to defend itself. We have a long-standing security relationship, and that's not going to change.
While the Pentagon defends U.S. arms sales to Israel, there is growing internal dissent among U.S. officials.
I decided to go public because it seemed that public pressure is the only thing that is contributing to any sort of shift.
We speak to a former U.S. official who resigned in protest over Washington's unconditional support for Israel. Hello, I'm Ghida Fakhry. Welcome to Bigger Than Five, as we look at the growing legal and political fallout from Israel's ongoing assault on Gaza. On today's program, Israel's key weapons suppliers face growing international pressure over their alleged violations of international law, as evidence of war crimes in Gaza continue to mount. More than 6 months on, there are growing calls for the U.S. and other Western governments to halt their arms transfers to Israel. Earlier this month, the UN Human Rights Council accused Israeli forces of committing crimes against humanity, urging states to halt all military exports to Israel, a call that was rejected by Germany and the United States, Israel's two main weapons suppliers. Germany supplies almost 30% of Israel's weapons, and since Israel's war on Gaza, German arms exports to Israel have risen tenfold. The U.S. provides almost 70% of Israel's weapons. Its annual contribution of $3.8 billion was boosted by an additional $14 billion approved in February. Meanwhile, here in the UK, the government is facing pressure to halt its arms exports to Israel following the advice it received from its lawyers that Israel has breached international humanitarian law in Gaza. From London to Washington, there is growing alarm over the government's possible violations of domestic and international laws. In a moment, we'll delve deeper into the issue with Pentagon Press Secretary Major General Patrick Ryder and former State Department Foreign Affairs Officer Annelle Sheline, who resigned in protest over these very concerns. But first, how military and diplomatic support for Israel's right to self-defense squares with the large-scale bombing and accusations of forced starvation in Gaza.
We will continue to support, not just philosophically, but tangibly, Israel's right to defend itself.
We strongly support Israel's right to defend itself.
Israel has a fundamental right to be able to defend itself.
Israel has the right to defend itself.
We absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself.
The right of self-defense can be invoked when a state is threatened by another state, which is not the case. Israel has not claimed that that has been threatened by another state. It's been threatened by an armed group, qualify it the way you want, but it's an armed group within the occupied territory. And frankly, even saying the war between Gaza and Israel is wrong, because Gaza is not a standalone entity, it's part of the occupied territory.
In the late 1990s, the U.S. Congress passed the Leahy Law, which prohibits the Departments of State and Defense from providing funds, assistance, or training to foreign security force units where there is credible information of human rights violations. The person behind the law, then Senator Patrick Leahy, has admitted it, quote, has not been applied consistently, and what we have seen in the West Bank and Gaza is a stark example of that. With mounting evidence of war crimes in Gaza, is the U.S. violating its own laws and international commitments? I spoke to Pentagon Press Secretary Major General Patrick Ryder. Major General Ryder, given the Leahy Law, how does the Pentagon justify the continuing provision of arms to Israel amidst the growing accusations of war crimes being committed in Gaza?
Well, Ghida, first of all, thanks very much for having me and the opportunity to talk today. It's important to understand that two things can be true at once. First of all, we fully recognize the terrible attack that Israel experienced on October 7th. Over 1,200 Israelis killed, over 200 people taken hostage, over half of whom are still being held hostage, and the existential threat that Hamas poses to the people of Israel. And so we understand that, and we're going to continue to support Israel and their ability to defend themselves. We've also expect that when Israel is combating Hamas, that it does it in a way that takes civilian safety and humanitarian assistance into account. And so since the very beginning of this conflict, we've been having that conversation with our Israeli partners at every occasion to remind them of the importance, and that also there's an expectation that the security assistance that we provide be used in accordance with international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict.
But clearly, General, reminding Israel of its obligations hasn't gone anywhere. How do you reconcile your ongoing military support for Israel with your own legal obligations?
Well, again, we recognize the tough fight that Israel is in. You've got an enemy in Hamas that has essentially taken a chapter out of ISIS's playbook by embedding itself within the civilian population in a dense urban environment. And so we recognize that's an extreme challenge. At the same time, again, as I mentioned, we've been having those conversations with our Israeli partners about the importance of taking civilian harm mitigation into account in planning and conducting their operations. No one wants to see innocent civilians killed, and no one wants to see this war spread into a wider regional conflict.
If that is the case, General Ryder, wouldn't it be far more effective to stop arming Israel?
Well, again, it's important to understand that in addition to this current conflict that Israel finds itself in with Hamas, there are broader regional security considerations that need to be taken into account, to include the threats posed by malign actors like Iran and its proxies in the region. So again, for regional security and stability reasons, we have stood by Israel for a very long time. We'll continue to do that. But again, we also understand the importance of protecting the safety of innocent civilians in Gaza and the Palestinian states.
You keep insisting on the need to protect civilians. You cannot simply pretend that serious war crimes against Palestinian civilians aren't taking place every single day, can you?
Well, again, we've seen that way too many civilians have been killed in this conflict, and we've acknowledged that on multiple occasions, which is why this has been so important to us to have those conversations with Israel, to ensure that they're employing the capabilities that we provide in accordance with the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law. And we'll continue to have those conversations.
But that's still not enough. And given the fact that Israel is blocking aid to Gaza, which is a war crime, many organizations have talked about the forced starvation being used as a weapon of war by Israel. The International Court of Justice has said there is a plausible case of genocide. A former foreign affairs officer at the State Department has accused the administration of being well aware of Israel's violations of international law. Yet we have never heard you, the administration, or the Pentagon condemn Israel's actions. Are you willing to condemn Israel's killing of Palestinians?
Well, I think we've been pretty clear that we don't want to see civilian harm, and that way too many civilians, Palestinian civilians, have been killed as a result of Israel's military operations, which is, again, why this continues to be a significant point of discussion between our two nations.
That's not the question,
but
though,
I also
General. Are you
would
willing
point
to
out the
condemn?
fact that,
Are you
again,
willing to
that
condemn
there's
these
some
killings?
responsibility that belongs to Hamas, which could easily stop this war by laying down its arms, by withdrawing its forces from civilian infrastructure. So they also bear some responsibility here, too.
And you have condemned Hamas. I'm wondering if, after more than 30,000 Palestinians, civilians for the most part, women and children, innocent men have been killed by Israel, are you willing to condemn Israel's actions?
Well, Ghida, again, I don't think I can be any more clear. We have said that way too many civilians have died in this conflict, and we want to see an end to that.
Israel, as you know, has used US-made and US-supplied weapons to commit mass murder, to destroy hospitals, to destroy universities, mosques, churches, entire neighborhoods in fact. It has blocked the entry of food and humanitarian aid. These are all serious violations of international humanitarian law, aren't they? Either rules and laws matter or they don't. Where does the U.S. stand on this?
Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, we provide security assistance to partner nations on the agreement that it will be used in accordance with international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict. And what we don't want to see is this fighting go on endlessly, where the people that suffer the most are innocent civilians.
And do you accept that this fighting would have stopped if the United States had stopped providing military support for Israel? Many people are saying that your support is what is prolonging this war.
Yeah, well, again, as I mentioned, the United States and Israel share a long-standing relationship, and it's important to understand, too, that there are threats in this region beyond Hamas, and that it's important that Israel be able to defend itself. Our support for Israel's inherent right to defend itself is ironclad. That's not going to change. And we understand that there are threats in this region which would seek to destroy and harm Israel further.
So just to be clear, General, would you characterize Israel's military campaign as self-defense? Yes or no?
Israel initiated, I'm not going to speak for their operations, but I would say that Israel initiated this campaign, of course, in response to Hamas's brutal attacks. And they have a right to defend themselves and to prevent future attacks by Hamas against the Israeli people.
How does the complete destruction of hospitals, of universities, amount to self-defense?
Again, Ghida, I'm not going to speak for Israel's operations. I've highlighted the fact that we definitely believe that Israel needs to take an approach that takes civilian safety into account, to include hospitals. Our policy going forward will be informed by Israeli actions on the ground. We want to see concrete steps that they're going to take civilian safety into account going forward. And so we're going to continue having those conversations.
We have seen Israeli reports that suggest that the IDF operates with a, quote, predetermined, authorized collateral damage rate of 20 Palestinian civilians per house. Is that acceptable? Are the tens of thousands of Palestinian deaths acceptable to you?
Well, I can't speak for Israel and their operations or their planning factors. That's really something for the IDF to talk to. But again, we acknowledge that way too many civilians have been killed in this conflict. And again, we're going to continue to talk and expect Israel to take civilian safety into account.
Has the U.S. government, has the Pentagon received any legal advice from its lawyers that it may be breaking U.S. and international laws by continuing to arm Israel?
Well, as you know, our State Department, Secretary Blinken recently traveled to Israel. He's met with leaders there. They have signed an acknowledgement that security assistance provided to Israel must be used in accordance with the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law.
General, the question is whether the U.S. government has received legal advice that it is breaking U.S. law by providing Israel with weapons.
Well, Ghida, of course, everything that we do, we're going to consult with our legal, advisors. But again, any aid that we provide to any country, there's the expectation that they're going to use that in accordance with the law of armed conflict.
How long can the U.S. administration continue to arm Israel and pretend that war crimes aren't taking place, General?
Bit of a loaded question there, Ghida. But again, as I highlighted, the United States and Israel share a long-term and long-standing security relationship. And our support for Israel and its inherent right to defend itself is ironclad. That's not going to change.
How much leverage does the United States have over Israel, and why isn't it using it? Why aren't you holding Israel to account? What would have happened if Russia had done the same in Ukraine?
Well, Ghida, again, from the very beginning, we have been talking with our Israeli partners about the importance of ensuring, as I highlighted, that civilian safety and welfare is taken into account. And so, when it comes to Israel's operations, of course, I'd refer you to them to talk specifics. But one of the ongoing conversations that we have is, again, ensuring that they're using security assistance in accordance with the law of armed conflict. But the bottom line is too many civilians are being killed, which is why you see the United States and why you heard our president highlight the fact that going forward, unless we see, concrete steps, that will inform our policy.
Pentagon Press Secretary Major General Patrick Ryder, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you, Ghida. I appreciate it.
So, do different rules apply to Israel? Even as the Israeli government continues to receive $3.8 billion in military assistance every year, the Biden administration bypassed Congress twice last month to deliver an additional $250 million in weapons. Annelle Sheline is a former State Department official who recently resigned in protest at the U.S.'s support for Israel. I spoke with her earlier. Annelle Sheline, you worked on human rights in the Middle East at the State Department before resigning at the end of March. What specifically drove you to take that decision, and do you feel that it's made any difference?
I resigned over the Biden administration's essentially unconditional support to the state of Israel and for the military actions it's conducting against Palestinians inside Gaza. I hope that it has had an effect. I decided to go public because it seemed that public pressure is the only thing that is contributing to any sort of shift. Again, there hasn't been enough. There needs to be a full ceasefire. There needs to be so much more aid getting into Gaza. But I hope that we are maybe starting to see a little bit of a shift here, and I wanted to try to contribute to that if I could.
How much silent dissent is there today at the State Department? I presume you are still in touch with some of your former colleagues. There have been reports that there were 8 dissent memos sent from State Department staff in just the first 2 months of Israel's assault on Gaza, and then 1 last month. Compared to the war in Iraq, the first 3 years, you had just 1 dissent memo sent.
Yes, and there's significant internal dissent. Many people are really appalled by what's happening. Although I don't know how many more dissent memos there have been, I'm fairly certain there have been many more. I think what's especially difficult for people is many people inside the State Department do the work that they do because they believe in it. They believe in the mission. They want for the United States to be a force for good in the world. And so, this administration came in promising to do that, to reestablish America's moral leadership, to try to build back some of the relationships that were undermined by the Trump administration. And many people inside the State Department really welcomed that. And so I think many people feel really betrayed by the way that this administration is not upholding those pledges that Biden made when he was coming into office.
And you've said that there has been ample evidence at the department of Israel's violation of international law in Gaza. What is the nature of the evidence that you were able to see? Because I know that you weren't working specifically on Israel-Gaza, but more broadly on human rights in the Middle East. Were you able to see the nature of the evidence, and how was it discussed internally?
So it's true. Israel-Palestine was not one of the countries in my portfolio, so I was not privy to these discussions. I am aware of some of the internal efforts to hold Israel accountable to follow U.S. law on this, specifically to follow the Leahy laws, for example, as well as Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act. I can't say much more about that, but just the problem is that there are people inside the State Department who are trying to ensure that U.S. law is followed. But until President Biden decides that he wants those policies to go into effect, we're not going to see any efforts to really hold Israel accountable.
But if there is such evidence, as you say, of Israel violating international humanitarian law, and if the U.S. government knows about it, is it fair to say that the U.S. is violating, without any doubt, its own laws?
Yes. The evidence is very clear, and the State Department is just unwilling to acknowledge it until the president signals that that's what he wants. Those inside the State Department have to fulfill the instructions they received from the White House.
To what extent is Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, responsible for the US's approach to Israel and Gaza? We've heard him express his dismay at the lack of outrage towards Hamas. Have you heard him privately, at least, express the same kind of outrage towards Israel's killing of innocent men, women, and children?
No, I've not heard him express the same level of outrage. I think in general, however, unfortunately, even sort of regardless of the personal feelings of the Secretary of State, that individual does report to the president. And, these kinds of decisions about the US-Israel relationship are made at the very highest levels inside the White House and the National Security Council.
How did witnessing the US continue to supply precision ammunition and lethal military aid to Israel, what impact has it had on you? What kind of ethical concerns does it raise?
I mean, it's been absolutely devastating for me and for so many other people inside the State Department. Very early on, members of the Israeli political establishment and military establishment were stating essentially a genocidal intent, or certainly an intent to engage in collective punishment. Very early on, the statements about cutting off food and electricity and water, that also, really disturbing videos of members of Israeli society mocking people inside of Gaza that were starving or suffering. I think earlier on, I felt that it was most effective to try to do what I could on the inside to participate in for example, I co-authored a dissent cable, which is part of this internal mechanism for dissent inside the State Department. I signed 2 other dissent cables, as we discussed. So I wanted to do what I could while on the inside, but over time it just became clear that there really wasn't much more I could do from the inside.
To what extent is Israel treated differently to any other country? Is it in a league of its own where the rules apply to every other country but not to Israel?
Israel is, I would say, the most special of the special cases, but we also see kind of special treatment for Saudi Arabia, for example, in terms of human rights abuses. Although, for example, with the Saudi conduct of the war in Yemen, we did see the Biden administration putting out a policy that they would no longer send offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia.
What would have happened if Russia had committed a fraction of the crimes that Israel is accused of in Ukraine?
I mean, we've already seen the U.S. efforts to condemn Russia for its actions, to try to galvanize international support. I do think the comparison between what Russia is doing to civilians in Ukraine and what Israel is doing to civilians in Gaza is important to keep in mind. And unfortunately, I do think that from the American side, that racism plays a big role here, that the condemnation of the killing of white people in Ukraine was so much, was full-throated, and yet we see, decades of dehumanization of Palestinians, and in general, just an unwillingness to call out what Israel is doing, even though, as you said, I mean, what Israel is doing is so much more extreme in terms of because Israel controls the territory of Gaza, and Gaza has been under blockade since 2007. The levels of famine, the absolute devastation of the entire territory, I think is truly without precedent.
Do you think, given the way the younger generation of American voters are viewing what's going on in Gaza, that this could cost Joe Biden the election?
I fear that could be true. I say I fear because I think Trump was quite detrimental to many aspects of life here in the U.S., and I fear for the future of American democracy if he does return to power. Unfortunately, the Biden administration is sounding increasingly Trumpian in, for example, their rejection of reality, and their positing alternate facts. For example, when they say they have found no violations or no examples of gross violations of human rights, for example. And Biden's image as someone who's compassionate and just sort of a good person, I think that image is starting to fall apart in the face of now 6 months of death and devastation wreaked by the Israeli military, with the direct support and funding from Biden's government.
Annelle Sheline, former Foreign Affairs Officer at the State Department, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Despite the public outrage and growing dissent within his own ranks, President Biden refuses to condition U.S. arms sales to Israel, even while he calls Netanyahu's approach a mistake. The most powerful nation in the world, unwilling to use its significant leverage to pressure a country that relies on it for military aid. As the evidence of war crimes continues to mount and dissent memos pile up, Biden's blank check to Israel comes at a considerable cost. Not only is it enabling the killing of tens of thousands of innocent victims, it is eroding America's already diminished moral standing. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team, thanks for watching.